Good evening and welcome to this next episode in our study of Dave Ramsey's book, Plan B. Last time we looked at we began the chapter about blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. That's Matthew chapter 5, verse 8. And we determined that that virtue that we're looking for in this chapter is integrity. And we looked at a little bit about what pure means. The purity is about something to being unadulterated, something that is the way it's not pretending to be something else than it really is. And an example from the real life would be that's the pure olive oil or unadulterated olive oil, or the wheat that has been winnowed so that there is no chaff in the wheat. And so it goes with the way that you think, the way that you act. It also needs to be unadulterated. It needs to be pure. And we looked a little bit about that concept of being perfect as your Heavenly Father is perfect. And we're going to get into a little bit more about that today. I think I'm going to begin with a reading of the text that's given here as an example of this integrity that we're talking about here. It's Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 to 26. And there are 3 sections in it, and it gives an example of something that the world would say would be bad, that you should not do it. And then an example of something that you should do, but you can't. And then the third option is that this is something you can do. So it's on page 48 in the book, and it's about 3 columns. And the first section of it is, and that's Matthew 5:21. The first verse is 5:21. You have heard it was said to the people long ago, do not murder. And anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. And I mean, that's how the world sees it. And it's pretty obvious to everyone that you should not murder. And then in verse 22 comes Jesus and says, but I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother or sister, and that is actually added because in today's language we say brother or sister instead of just brother. But so that was something Dave Andrew added to the text, whatever translation he used here. So, but I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Anyone who says to his brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the Sanhedrin. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. That was Matthew 5:22. So even Jesus did not refrain from calling people fools. So he's giving here an example of things that you might not think of as something that you could do, and if the standard is that this is what you should do, then you just can't. So Jesus comes now in verse 23 and says, therefore. And every time you see something that's therefore, you better sit up and pay attention, because this is what Jesus wants you to do. So verse 23, therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother or sister. Then come and offer your gift. Settle matters or make friends quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. And that's Matthew 5, verses 23 to 26. So if you look at this, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. You should just leave your gift at the altar and go and talk to your brother or sister. You have some problem with him or her, and then come back and do your offering. See, this is totally doable. And this is what Jesus wants you to do. So, trying for me to explain that is probably not a good idea, but I'll read what Dave Andrews says about it, and it makes a lot of sense to me. So give me a second, I'll just turn the page here and do that. First, he gives an example of theologians or people who study the Bible, of the misunderstanding that there's something you can do on your own to be perfect. So let me start here. In the Sermon on the Mount, the traits Jesus advocated we incorporate into our character include humility, empathy, self-control, and we talked about that before when he says that it is okay for you to be angry. You just have to do it in a controlled way. You can't just go into a rage and get off on people. Righteousness, which is also another word for justice. Mercy, integrity, and integrity is what we're talking about in this chapter. Nonviolence and perseverance. Some Christian scholars, like Dallas Willard, and this is going to be an example of how not to do it, believe that what Jesus was saying in the Sermon on the Mount was that his disciples needed to learn to distinguish between the higher ideals he advocated and the lower ideals the society advocated, and be committed to practicing these higher ideals. Thus, for example, Willard says Jesus calls his disciples to practice in the high ideal of no anger rather than the lower ideal of no murder. So here, Dave Andrews gives again the first part of Matthew 5, 21 and 22, up to where it says therefore. So I'll just repeat those again. So there's the world standard and the one that the theologians want you to follow, but you can't. The lower ideal of Jewish tradition is, you have heard it was said to the people long ago, do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. And then the higher ideal of Jesus' mission that you cannot achieve. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. For example, anyone who says to his brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the Sanhedrin, and anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Matthew 5:22. The trouble with this perspective is that the higher ideal advocated is not only completely unrealistic, but also unbiblical. None of our examples of perfection in the Bible, not even Jesus, practiced no anger as his principle. We saw that before. Not only did Jesus get angry, he occasionally called his opponents fools. We already mentioned that, and that's in Matthew 23, verse 17. Christian scholars like Glenn Stassen and David Gushee believe that, and these are going to be two examples, an example of some theologians who get it right. Believe that while saintly Christian scholars like Dallas Willard are right in asserting what Jesus was saying in the Sermon on the Mount was that his disciples needed to be able to distinguish between the higher ideals he advocated and the lower ideals his society advocated. They have been wrong when it comes to identifying these higher ideals. They have identified unrealistic ideals that Jesus never advocated, but those of us who have tried to practice them have experienced profound disappointment. So again, they're saying that this ideal, you just can't do it. If we read the Sermon on the Mount carefully, and we do, we will notice when Jesus contrasts society ideals with his ideals. He doesn't simply state society's lower ideals and then his higher ideals. Second, instead he states society's ideals first, then he identifies the vicious cycle of unresolved problems that society's ideals do not deal with. And finally, he represents his higher ideals, which alone can solve the unresolved problems of the world, Jesus' higher ideals, which are actually very realistic, but incredibly creative, transformative initiatives, are to be found not in his second statement, but in his third set of statements. And we saw that before when I read the passage. I divided it into three sections. And the third one was the one that's totally achievable for everyone. So it also has a little bit to do with this idea that there is a practice or a routine that you can do to be pure in heart. That's just not true. What you have to do is to study Jesus, learn who he is, and then act in the way that he models for us. So even though, he gets angry, it is okay to be angry. You just can't get out of control when you're angry. So Dave Andrews continues, it is clear that the emphasis here is not on the second point, but on the third point. Yeah, we saw that. And I mentioned it several times already. The imperative we had to take to heart is not an unrealistic, no anger policy, but a creative response to conflict resolution. If we were to be pure in heart, according to Sermon on the Mount, we need to reflect on the first set of points, consider the second set of points, and always act on the third set of points that Jesus is making. And then on page 48 is the passage that I read before. We're not going to do that again. But Dave Andrews continues, we are in a big mess. Jesus says that parading our piety, praying publicly and condemning other people while nursing our lust, being angry and abusive, returning evil for evil, and abandoning our commitments to one another only makes things worse. He tells us to clean up our act, we need to develop an unpretentious spirituality that quietly deals with temptation, gently encourages everyone in their desire to do right, loves all people, including those who hate us, and works creatively to real change in the world. For heaven on earth, by returning to the other cheek, taking the plank out of our own eye, and being reconciled with all of our strange brothers and sisters in the human family. So in other words, it's like a spiritual transformation that we have to go through. He calls it an unpretentious spirituality, something that's not fake, something that is authentic and real. You don't display your good deeds and then you're totally rotten, and because you have ulterior motives to do them inside. So, yeah. Jesus says that all those who clean up their act, practicing his idealistic but realistic initiatives, will see God. They certainly will. The pure in heart will see God reflected in everything they say and do. Yeah, so that was the end of the chapter, but he's giving like 14, the next 2 pages he's giving 14 examples of how this works, because the one that we read before is just one of them. Let me just give you a couple of examples here from the book. I'm not going to read through all of them. I think you can, if you have the book, I encourage you to obtain. If you don't have a book, I encourage you to obtain one and read them for yourself. It's on page 50 and 51. So there are 3 columns. The first column is called traditional norms, the way the world sees things. And the next one column is the vicious cycle, the unattainable ideals. And then the third column is called transforming initiatives. So in other words, the way you act to change the world. By the way, the subtitle of the book is called Be the Change You Want to See in the World. So yeah, this is all about that. So the first example here is don't kill. I think that was pretty much the example we had already. But being so angry you're abusive can be brutal too. It's a vicious cycle that's going to happen. And the transformative initiative is to go be reconciled. That's actually the example that we saw, that I read for you before, except it's like condensed. And the second one he comes up with here is the traditional, according to the world, is don't quit. That's pretty logical for everyone. And then the vicious cycle, the unattainable idea is the slow burn lust is adultery in your heart. So it doesn't have to be physical. As long as you think about it, you already committed adultery in your heart. And there's just no way that you cannot do that, probably. So the transforming initiative here is, so remove yourself from the temptation. So if you are likely to get into a situation where you might have lust in your heart, then remove yourself from that situation. A third example is you can divorce, that's what the world says, but Jesus says, but divorce usually involves infidelity. And the cure for that is to go and be reconciled. And the fourth example he's giving is, don't swear falsely. That's the world says that. And the vicious cycle is, but taking any oath suggests making false claims. So if you swear an oath, that means that you sometimes make false claims. You're not totally truthful all the time. So there's again, it's an impossible quest to ideal to live up to. So the solution is let your yes be yes and your no be no. Fifth example is take an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's the world. The vicious cycle is, but retaliating entails returning evil for evil. So again, evil, you return evil for evil, and just a little bit higher than before, and then you have a vicious cycle going. And the solution to that is turn the other cheek. So, and it could also mean that you ignore if somebody against you, say something against you, you can simply ignore it, and sometimes if it's not too vicious. Sixth example, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. That's the world. The vicious cycle is, but hating enemies doesn't deal with enmity. So if you're hating somebody, you will never be reconciled. So the solution is to love your enemies, bless those who curse you. Seventh example is contributing publicly. So you make a contribution to a charity and you tell the world about it. Companies do that all the time. So in the vicious cycle is parading your charity, not practicing generosity. So you parade your charity, and you're not really generous at all, because you expect to get something in return. So give without advertising it. Number 8, fasting publicly. Is parading your piety, not practicing sincerity. So you're not really sincere, you just have to show that you are practicing a routine or a ritual. Fast without publicizing, so you do your fast on your own by yourself without telling anybody. Praying publicly, and we definitely have examples of Jesus talking about that. Is parading your religiosity, not practicing spirituality. You're not spiritual, you're simply mimicking or robotically doing your religious activity. It has no meaning, really. Pray authentically in secret. So that's what he says. Go into your room and pray. Number 1, lots of prayer. And that vicious cycle is simply repeating a lot of empty sacred phrases. So a lot of number of, it's not the quantity, it's the quality. Make the Lord's Prayer the prayer of your heart. And we can actually do that. We can go through the Lord's Prayer one day and see what it actually says, because it is the words say them automatically and don't really know what it means. So we should probably do that someday. Pile up treasures on earth. Number 11. And that's vicious cycle, but thieves break in and steal. So if you pile up your treasure, some people might come and store up treasures in heaven. Nobody can get it in heaven. Number 12, no one can serve 2 different masters. In the vicious cycle, it's impossible to serve God and money at the same time. So seek the kingdom of God and don't worry about money. Number 13, do not judge lest you be judged. Vicious cycle, if you judge, you'll be by the very same standard. Yeah. Again, it's impossible to live up to your own standard. So take the plank out of your own eye before you take the speck out of your neighbor's. Number 14, do not throw your pearls before swine. They will trample on them and then tear you to pieces. The solution is the only one you can totally entrust yourself to is God. So, and that's the end of today's lesson. Next week, we're going to go to blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Matthew 5:9, if you want to read ahead. So, and thank you for coming, and I appreciate that, and we'll see you again next week.